we get a second dose of Mr. Brian Powell. And this is probably going to be a very lively discussion because on one of the posts he put, we saw a lot of opinionated responses. So let's hope it is lively. His topic is good LabVIEW habits.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Good. Is Jim still in here, or do you leave? Okay. I was just going to call out Jim for all the work he's done on VIPM and just the stuff he's done for the community and the stuff he's pushing on with Dragon. It's very much appreciated by I think all of us in here. Okay, so I'm going to talk about good LabVIEW habits. This was actually I submitted a couple of topics, and this was one of them. And then the schedule looked like it was going to be full. And so we actually pulled this one out and we weren't going to do it. But then Jeremy gave me a call and said, hey, we'd like to, some more beginner kind of content. So we put it back in. And so this is kind of comes from, I see a lot of other people's code and I see a lot of, like, why do you do things that I think, just doesn't everybody know that you do things a certain way? And so I decided, let's make a presentation out of what I think are some just kind of good habits to pick up. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, about what that means. Turn that on. See if that works. Good. Okay, our giants are female. So yesterday was kind of a more historical one. This one's more contemporary. There's a woman named Dr. Jennifer Goldbeck, who's a professor in information sciences and computer sciences and something else at the University of Maryland. And she's an expert. She's like one of the first users and creators of social networks and is an expert in social trust and how people get information from social relationships, everything from like the Netflix recommendations kind of stuff, but also, just kind of, how disinformation propagates and things like that. So she's is an expert on that, talks on MSNBC and has been featured on a Netflix show about social networks. But the other reason is she and her husband are like saints when it comes to rescuing golden retrievers. They currently have 6 golden retrievers, most of which have geriatric problems. Like one just had an arm amputated from cancer. Another one has diabetes and is blind and thyroid problems. And so they have this weekly podcast where they talk about their dogs and all that stuff that goes into it. And that's part of her, kind of social media knowledge, because she actually has several Instagram accounts. She has, these multiple podcasts. One is called Murders in Paradise, which is about various murders that have happened in the Florida Keys, which is where they live. And so it's kind of interesting just from a social media perspective, how she's not only an expert in how social media works, she also can make things go viral on TikTok with some of her videos because she knows all the algorithms work. I have a golden retriever too. I also have a Great Pyrenees, so I'm entertained by her podcasts. Who am I? I'm still pretty much the same person I was yesterday. Though I have kind of grown with GDevCon in the last day. So I want to thank the LabVIEW champion. So after, it's like, when I submitted this, it's like, well, I don't actually want to write the content. I'm going to have the LabVIEW champions do it for me. And so I posted on the LabVIEW champions forum and it's soliciting, what are some good LabVIEW habits? And everybody posted something different. And maybe half of it I agreed with. And so I chose ones that I tended to agree with. Some of these are mine, some are the LabVIEW champions, but just a big thanks to the LabVIEW champions. If you're a LabVIEW champion, raise your hand. Yeah, so I know at least some of you, maybe most of you actually submitted to my post, so thank you for that. Okay, so these are habits, they're not rules. I was originally thinking 30 habits in 30 minutes, but then I realized that some of these habits are going to cause more discussion. And so I think I'm down to about 15 habits. There's no particular order to them. Some are small, some are big. Not everybody agrees with them. Just go ahead and, and that's where some of the discussion may come. And so I would recommend that you don't adopt any of these unless you really understand the why and make sure that it fits into your way of developing. And then if we have time at the end, which I think we will, then maybe some of you can throw out your good habits, and then I can tell you why I didn't include those in my presentation. Okay, number 1. Tools options, place front panel terminal as icons. I hate that. It just to me, one, it takes up too much space, and it also, these look more like VIs than that. Like, I like the visual distinction between a terminal and the other things here, where this just looks like a sub VI call, in my view. Right? Who does this? Okay. Yeah, who agrees with me? Yeah, okay. Who wants to lobby NI to change the default? Yeah. Stephen, you noting this? Right? You're the one who wanted one of the other ones to be changed to default. So, okay, but yeah, it takes up extra space. Okay, turn off automatic error handling. Yeah. Who wants to comment on this one? Darren, I know you have a whole presentation that talks about stuff like that. Anybody want to comment on some of the evils of automatic error handling? Okay. Doesn't work in the runtime. I hadn't realized that, but yeah. So
I disagree. I think it should be on because if I have an unhandled error, that's a bug, and I want to know about it. Yeah. Some of there were comments from the champions along those lines. Q, do you want to?
I was agreeing, but I can.
Okay.
I can say a few words. Yeah, I agree with Hope, but for development, and then afterwards turn it off. But for development, leave it on. That's my opinion.
Yep. I think if you're going to do that, turning it off for deployment. I think I'm going to get to what you're about to say. So wait a second. So one of the things I was going to say is that like this changes something in the INI file about how LabVIEW behaves, like enable automatic error handling. So then if I give you my VIs and you have a different setting, then it's going to behave differently when I give you my VIs to somebody else, right? That to me is like the biggest issue, is that this makes it hard for us to share something and share our environments, right? So I maybe could have tolerated this if it really stuck with the VI. And then let me talk about the next slide, which is 2B. There's one, we saw the tools options one. There's also one that's per VI that you should go and change. But that there's a VI analyzer test that one tests to see whether the setting is on or off, and fails if it's on, I think. But then notice this comment here. Note that if you wish to only check VIs that have unwired error terminals that may trigger automatic error handling dialogues, use yet another VI analyzer test called error cluster wired, so that you could actually go and see where did I not wire my error clusters, and then that's maybe what I should spend my time on instead of turning on automatic error handling. Is that what you were going to say?
It is not.
Okay, you go ahead.
Is this thing on? I have a solution that I think will make all of us happy, actually. I often start statements with one of the few things I liked about LabVIEW NXG. And so this is one of those statements. Automatic error handling was a per project setting in LabVIEW NXG. You could enable it for the entire project or disable it for the entire project. I think if we had that feature in LabVIEW, it would pretty much solve everything for all of us, because some of us would turn it on for the project and some of us would turn it off for the project, and I'd be fine with that.
And then when I shared VIs, I would be sharing the whole project and would go with you.
And as a subpoint, it confounds a source code setting with an environment setting. And this is the evil part right here. It's not the tools options. People can turn it on and off for their own development use. Totally fine with that. This is the evil part, that it gets bound into your source code and it's hidden.
Yeah. Yep. Alan.
I have never, so all of that is true and I agree. I have never liked it because I see it as a bad productivity aid. Because okay, you turn it on because you want to catch all of your bugs that you weren't counting on finding, and then you come to rely on the development environment finding your errors for you, and I think that can actually become a block to developing good error handling, because you're fundamentally not, in my mind, you're fundamentally not doing it right here, and you're relying on the environment to make it right, and then the environment changes and suddenly it doesn't work anymore. So there's that, and what was the other one? My can't remember shit is kicking up today.
Let me comment on that while you think of your second thing. And so one of the ways to interpret what you said, and this is, I think, overstating it, is, well, it's sort of the lazy man's error handling. And I think that's a little bit unfair, because, using it in development, it means that things are unexpectedly erroring, and it was in a place that I just really did not expect to have to handle an error. And so, there is some merit to that argument of having that sort of thing on. But I also think that a lot of us write code where we know that there is likely to be an error happen. We are going to handle it, and we don't want this to be the thing that handles it. And it may not be that I want to wire that output. I may just want to let it drop on the floor and be ignored.
That was actually the next thing I was going to say, is that there are, and I get into these, and they're fights, man. They are fights. I get into them all the time. It's like, you need to wire that error out just to clear it. And then it's like, why am I adding code to my block diagram? Why am I adding clutter to my block diagram to throw away, just to throw away an error I know I want to ignore because that's on?
Yeah.
And I hate that. I know he's raised. Yeah, I know. We're one of the people I fight with.
It's not because it's on. It's because you need to document that you intended to throw it away.
Yeah, I know. We've talked about that too. The VI I wrote to do that is called VI Analyzer Pacifier.
The documentation is that you didn't wire it. That happens by accident all the time. Blessings be upon you and your sainted code. Mine is not so clean.
And so that's all the time we've got. We just had two good habits. Thank you. I really do appreciate the commentary. Let's move on. Number 3, use source code control. Who does not use source code control for their stuff? Good answer that nobody was brave enough to raise their hand. How many of you don't use source code control when you're the only developer on the project? Yeah, there's some hands raised up. So I use it even when I'm the only developer, because I want to protect myself from myself. A lot of times, I want to go experiment. I want to okay, I've got this part working, but like the project yesterday, when I switched from DataSocket to MQTT, I checked in a working version that used DataSocket and made a branch. And I don't know if this MQTT is going to go work, but let's go make our changes here. Touches lots of VIs, changes a whole bunch of things. And when it worked and I was happy with the result, then I merged that back in. But I knew I always had an out to just throw away that branch. And I could also try both branches. Like, how did this behave with DataSocket? Oh, and let's make it behave that way with MQTT. So I do that even for myself. And then also just, having that history of what I did when. and why I made certain changes. There's better ways, so there's some good practices around commenting and how you chunk up your submissions, but I think just in general, using source code control is a good idea. Related to that, separate compiled code from VIs. I personally haven't had problems with the VI compile cache, except occasionally knows that it's corrupted and rebuilds itself. But compared to when this feature was first introduced, it's been pretty reliable to me. And then just making it smaller for checking into the source code control system, because some of my code I have to keep on premise, and so I have my own GitLab server that I run locally, and I don't like to just fill it up with compiled VIs. So I always separate that. And then related to that, 4B is that there's more than one place to find that setting. It's per project in addition to the default for things. And then you have to go into mark existing items, and for whatever reasons, I have VIs that stray, that show up into my project that somehow don't have that setting right. So from time to time, I go and just see what's in my project and make sure that everything is marked the way that I want it marked. Especially if I'm sharing code with other people that may not have that setting on. And so this is an example of a good habit of, if I'm going to work with you on a project, I want to make sure we both agree on the setting so that we're not just causing changes for each other because of that. What else? Number 5, use subdiagram labels. So I don't remember when that was introduced, but that's a great feature. Who is not even aware of subdiagram labels? Right, good. Who doesn't use them? Who hates them? Norm figures.
I like the label.
Both. So I like it just because it sticks with the loop or the case or whatever. One of the, it's a different application I've got where, an older version of LabVIEW that didn't have that. And so you have these, free labels. And sometimes your code moves, but the free label, that it's trying to talk about doesn't go with it. And so to me, this is I have one place that I know to go to understand what's going on in this loop. And so I think that's a good habit to get into. And especially the different cases of a case structure. Why is this case different from another case? And don't just say, error, no error, because that is already in this part. It's more of, in the error case, what is it I'm trying to do? It's be sure to propagate this error to an MQTT connection, something like that. Norm. Take all the time you want, Norm.
Limits and boundaries. That's what a person like me needs. So I mentioned the label thing earlier, and I'm not really completely against the subdiagrams, but for things like cases, it's a tactic that I learned a long time ago that I don't think enough people do for something like a Boolean case. Well, do I really need a subdiagram label in true to describe true and false to describe false, or would it be better for that documentation to just simply have the label enabled describing what the case is? And it's just one of sometimes it's not, so that's not a disagreement that that's a bad idea. It's one of these, hey, like a 5B is don't just use subdiagram labels, use the diagram or the structure label as well, potentially. Like for a for loop, a great example, gets all weird. I don't know, like I said, I have a variety of different thoughts, but using the label is something I don't see often. I've seen a lot of value in it. It's something I learned a long time ago, wanted to share.
Yeah, so let me rephrase that and see if I get what you just said. This isn't a particularly good example, but it's sort of like if you're describing why there's a case structure here, or a loop or whatever, then, but especially a case structure since there's multiple frames, or a flat sequence structure. Why is this here? Then that applies to all cases, right? But then if you want to describe what each case is for, that's inside, and that's where you document it here, right? Is that? Yeah.
Yeah, sort of along those lines. I always use both, where the label for a case is the question that the case structure is answering. So it ends with a question mark. And for a for loop, it always starts with the words loop through, and then the thing it's looping through. And then the subdiagram says, what is it doing?
Yeah, what's
So-
the answer to that question?
Yeah, loop through, dates, and then take the date and just get me the year. So get year from date, it would be the subdiagram, and loop through dates would be the for loop label.
Yep, that's good practice. Alan?
So it just occurred to me in looking at this, there is a fundamental difference between the label and then the subdiagram label. The structure label is code, honestly. In some situations, it may matter if what you're doing is you have a template. Because think about this, Sam and I have a template and some tools that go with it, and the tool goes looking for the label on the diagram. So putting a really descriptive label on the structure is, I don't want to have to type that 47 times in my scripting code when I go look for this thing, right? And that's not going to matter for a lot. 95, 98% of LabVIEW code out there, that isn't going to matter. But it is something to keep in mind. And it's an argument for the subdiagram label, is that I can put whatever the hell I want in there. But I may want to have a really short, DQMH event main, because I may need to go find that in a scripting tool.
Yep, that's how
So-
DQMH scripting works.
Yeah.
It looks for things like that and that to find the event handling loop or the message handling.
Sam and I have, the events for UI actors, and it goes hunting for the event structure that is supposed to handle it, because you might have two event structures. So
I'd just like to make the point that if you put a free label in there and then you end up resizing the case structure and the free label's in the way, you need to do a lot of scooting. So this kind of eliminates some scooting.
Yep. Okay, let's move on. Number 6, don't use the dynamic data type. Who uses the dynamic data type? Who likes it? Who thinks it's a good idea? Well, it depends on what it's doing. Well, it can do so many different things. That's part of the problem. I use this example just because, here's a dynamic data type, and you can wire it to anything, and it does something. Right? Who knows what happens when you wire it to numeric? The last value of so this is essentially an array of waveforms. So it's an array of a cluster, of a timestamp, and a delta t, an array of double precision numbers, and I think a variant. And so if you wire it to a graph, it'll graph the array of waveforms. If you wire it to numeric, it'll wire the last value of one of those waveforms. I don't know which one. If you wire it to a Boolean, it takes the last value of one of those waveforms, and if it's 0, it's false, and if it's non-zero, it's true, etc. And so there's a whole lot of magic that this is trying to do. And it was invented to try to make LabVIEW so easy that you didn't have to learn how LabVIEW worked and how loops worked and unbundles and things like that. But the problem is that it doesn't work, doesn't go very far. And so at some point you have to learn how loops work, and you have to learn how unbundlers work, and you have to learn how the rest of LabVIEW works. And so it kind of defeats the purpose of having the dynamic data type. And so there's a good chance that it's going to do something you don't expect, and you have to go figure out what that is. And especially if you're a novice who doesn't understand loops or unbundlers, you're going to just be confused. So that's my soapbox, and we never should have put this in, but I lost that vote.
So just 2 points. I believe that it's the red coercion dot that's really the problem here. And you can do an explicit conversion and it's not ambiguous. But to the other point, LabVIEW Core 1 is teaching DACMX pretty much. So you don't necessarily need this anymore. So.
Well, a lot of the Express VIs still create the DDTs, so it's still there. The coercion dot, yeah, there are various conversion functions that also provide some of that magic. But I think if you were really to remove the ambiguity, you're going to start to use like the, well, let's do a loop, and we'll loop, or we'll do an array index to get the waveform that I care about, and then I'm going to do a waveform unbundle to get to the Y array, and then I'm going to get the last value with an array index, and I'm going to test that for 0, compare it to 0 to wire to my Boolean. So that would be the explicit way of doing this. When, perhaps if you really had something that was going to map to a Boolean, maybe it should have just been created as a Boolean instead of try to fit it into an array of waveforms structure. Okay, Stephen, did you have something? Okay. Let's see. Number 7. So using Typedefs for various things. Just examples. Typedefs for or classes for clusters that I'm going to use in multiple places. Typedefs for enums, just to make it easy. If it's going to change, you're going to need to go visit every place that those things change. And so, for example, in one of my projects that I did for a lab, I had measurement results of what's the measurement name, what's the value, did it pass or fail, and that was used all over the place. And so, just made a typedef of that. Even have an array of those typedefs because sometimes I'm returning or logging an array of those measurement values. So I think it's another just good habit to get into. Classes are sort of taking care of that for me when I do that with the class data type.
I'm sorry, Brian. We should just take this offline because you're describing core 1 and 2, which I teach pretty much, once a month on most of these things. So strict typedefs, I'm interested in people's feelings. I don't elevate personally to strict typedefs unless I have to. I find it constraining. But what would you say about that?
Yeah, I do have an opinion on strict versus non-strict typedefs. I wish that, so strict typedefs, anything about the control that changes, that change propagates to every reference. A non-strict typedef is only based on the data type. So if the data type does not change, then it doesn't propagate. So where does that, then there's this kind of in-between thing that I wish that we had. So for example, bless you, Norm. Bless you, So like an enum, for example, the enumeration is the data type. And so if I add a value to the enumeration, then that propagates everywhere, even if it's a non-strict typedef. But say I have like a menu ring where, or I forget, the terminology, but like one has a string data type based on, a drop-down list, combo box. There's also one that has a numeric data type that's also a drop-down list. And so the data type stays the same even if I add elements to the list of things that I can choose from the drop-down. And so if I add a new value to that drop-down, in order for it to propagate, that has to be a strict typedef. But the problem is I maybe don't want every one of them to look exactly the same, same width, same everything, wherever it's propagated. And so that's where I wish we could have something in between. But in that case, usually I just live with it being a strict typedef and, size it, approximately right and use it, depend on that everywhere. So does that address some of your questions?
I agree with everything you said.
Okay. But I think that's one of the things that not everybody understands is that difference between strict and non-strict. So non-strict, only if the data type changes does it update. And strict, it's all or nothing. Everything goes. Including, for example, like this, this, whatever this style is called, silver style here on these controls. Every one of them is using silver style. And even if some VIs I don't want to use silver style, well, it's in the strict Typedefs, so it goes there. Okay, number 8. Use quick drop. I used to know where everything was in the palettes. But that was many versions of LabVIEW ago. And, you get to be pretty fast on finding those things. But, just these days, not plausible. And so, same as on my Mac where, I hit Command Spacebar. Well, you don't see it up there. But, to search for things, having quick drop to be able to search for things. Yeah. And also the fact that you don't have to always get everything exactly right. I think I can search for like FFT and still find spectral measurements.
Yeah, I'm not against quick drop. I just don't quite get the use of it. Because a lot of my job is to think about what I'm doing and do the right thing. And the actual coding is the least of what I'm doing. And so I feel like, I'm saving 3 seconds or 10 seconds. Doesn't really seem terribly worthwhile to me. I mean, if you enjoy it, that's great. I don't have any objection to it, but I just don't quite grasp what the point of it is.
Well, for me, and I'll let Darren or others comment on this, 3 seconds is actually a little annoying. I just want to find divide. I know that I want divide. I know that's what I want to use here. I could go right click and go to the numeric palette, and it's, I don't know, the third one across or the, some row down, and I have to go visually interrupt my flow to go and find that. Versus, I know I want divide this, div, hit return, and it's right there. And so it's kind of that interruption of now I've got to think about where it is. And divide, these parts I know where to find things because these have been in LabVIEW since a long, long time, since whenever we had this version of palette menus. But when I'm going and searching for spectral measurements, it's is that it, or is one of these other ones it? Finding that signal processing palette, and then finding what is it called, and where it is. To me, it's the speed up of quick drop when I know what it's called, makes a lot of sense. Now, a time when I don't use quick drop is, for example, say like, I'd want to do some TDMS file I/O. And one, I'm not that familiar with what things are called. And there's a good chance that I really, I'm going to want an open and I'm going to want to close and I'm going to want a read or a write or maybe both. And so I'll just open up the TDMS palette and then drag the icons off of that. Because one, I know that they're all right there. I know that they're placed in order on the palette. And I'm more likely to get it all working that way, faster than typing in quick drop. So there are several people want to comment, so we'll start with Hope.
Yeah, the extreme pro tip version of this is use class method browser with the quick drop. If you guys haven't used it, basically you can install it on VIPM, and then when you do quick drop, then you can do Control C if you've clicked on a class or a class Y or a class method, and it will show you all of the class related functions, including ancestor classes. It also works for actors. If you do Control Shift C, you can see all the messages.
Yep, good to know. Good plug. Norm, you got the mic, so you go, and then we'll go back here.
Anyway, one thing, so I'm a bit of a convert, right? I used to not be quick dropper, eventually got there. But one of the things that continue as we as mentors in the room to a lot of people learning, a big failure I've seen is people don't go to the palette as they're learning. And that's, sure, we know the names of the vast majority of all the things we're looking for, but it's such a of course use quick drop, like from day one kind of thing. And people start putting together strange, unusual diagrams. Did you not realize there was something for exactly what you're doing in the array, but you're doing it the hard way? And people just, newbies tend to just think, oh, I'm just supposed to start typing words until I'm Googling, right? I'm just Googling for a function that sounds like what I'm looking for, as opposed to trying to understand that bigger picture of what's there. So I'm not against it. I'm thinking about, for the educators in the room that are teaching LabVIEW Core 1 and stuff, is to also be advocating for that other aspect of it, so people don't get stuck in this trap of searching for things that don't exist because they're calling it wrong along the way. So just some thoughts as we mentor people.
Yeah, that's a good point, because we put a lot of thought into how some of the palettes are laid out. So for example, DACMX, there is real thought about what's on the first row and what's on the second row and what's on the left side, what's on the right side of that palette. Like instrument drivers are that way. Initialize is always the upper left and close is always in the upper right, and then what goes in between is in between on the palettes. So you kind of learn how the API works by looking at the palettes. And then there's also an exploration kind of thing. So like this is the filters palette, and like, well, what are my options? If I could type in quick drop and I could see filters, and I might see several answers, or I could just look at this and start to just like see what's in this palette for filters. Here's a Butterworth filter, and here's some other kind of filter, and see what my options are. And so that exploration, I think, is another piece of that. Back here.
Yeah, so besides just dropping things, which is really nice, the shortcuts are the real power. Insert being, it's got to be the top one. Insert a bundle, insert an unbundle. Replace, delete, remove. Not delete, remove.
Yeah, there's lots of wonderful
and then
magic.
everything you come up with yourself in your own scripting to make your own habits the best.
Yep, completely agree.
So, I get what Norm's saying, but from a CPI perspective, I'm like Jason. I teach 1 to 2 classes a month, and the classes are not set up for you to take the time to teach them that kind of content. And they jump right into quick drop, and they don't tell you to teach where things are on the palette. Is that a flaw in the class? Perhaps, but you try to do both. But my opinion is quick drop improves your programming efficiency to such a great degree that you really need to get people started in on it right away and using it.
Yeah. Would I say it's a flaw in the class? Yes, one of many flaws in the class.
So I will answer that as another CPI. When I'm teaching actor framework, I do both. I show them the palette, and then I will actually say, oh, and it's quick drop, you can type these characters, and it'll get you that function. So I'm actually reinforcing both, because the palette is terribly handy, but it's also 3 layers down for actor framework. And about the 15th time you have to go find read, self, and cure, you realize that quick drop is your best friend.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. Use the project. Who doesn't use the project? Okay, good. Thanks. Nobody admitted to that. Yeah, that's true. A lot of features now require the project, like being able to build an executable, things like that. So, no discussion.
Back to the project, one of the things I really didn't like about NXG was that you couldn't have just a standalone VI. You're just screwing around trying to figure something out. And it's one of the nice things about conventional LabVIEW is you can I want just a single VI to play around and sort something out.
Yep. Yeah, that was when we first created the project. I made sure that Control-N still just brought up a new blank VI without having to bring up the slow loading dialog to select what it is I wanted to create. Now, I still find myself creating an empty project first, because I've got that as like one of my saved, or one of my defaults in the getting started window. And then I'll create a new VI. And then I won't save anything. But yeah, I think that kind of speed of just I want to get to a block diagram and look up something. So yeah, making that fast. Related, occasionally checking the files view for stray VIs. Like this was a, I forget what customer. Oh yeah, this project never actually shipped. But I noticed here when I went to the files view, and I actually did not know that this actually referenced this example in the LabVIEW directory in my project until I was preparing for this presentation, and it's like, here's an example of something that's choosing an example and using that as a sub VI. Fortunately, this is a useful example, and it's kind of constructed to be a sub VI, but so I guess it was a sub VI of a bigger example for probability and statistics. It was a useful sub VI that was not in vi.lib, and I should have just copied that and made it my own since it's an example, and that would have made making sure that if I, for example, want to create a zip file to send the source code to a customer, it's always got to find the root directory and back. Essentially, it's going to be a zip file that doesn't just contain this. It's also going to contain the Mac home, Git readiness, and C program files, National Instruments LabVIEW 2019, all as part of this zip file because of the way the references work inside of LabVIEW. So checking this from time to time. I don't know if there's any sort of vi.lib or VI analyzer test to test for things outside of a project directory. Norm.
Not only is probably the files view not, this is great that you're highlighting it here, but also the fact that you can move clumps of VIs, you can drag and drop, sometimes to your own peril, because sometimes it actually copies VIs instead of moves them. But those big group operations that allow VIs to stay linked appropriately in the project, all via this tab. So just kind of raising that awareness flag.
Yep. Yeah. So like here, I wouldn't actually want to move the example sub VI. I'd want to make sure I copied it, probably renamed it so that it didn't interfere. Yes, back here.
I also got a little fearful of doing a lot of mass moves when I had the project crash a few versions back, and I realized I don't know the current status of that, but there was an issue doing mass moves, so it scared me a little bit. I don't know what the status is on that.
I don't know either. There's multiple strategies for doing that mass move, or kind of my typical experience is that I've saved a few things in the wrong spot on disk. Like my project might be right with virtual folders, and usually I try to have my virtual folders mapped to the file system, but I don't usually do the auto-populating version. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. And it's just like, I've got this thing that's in the pass-fail test that really belongs as part of like the digitizer VIs. And it's like, I just clearly saved it in the wrong spot. So sometimes, I try to avoid this, but sometimes I'll just move it on disk and then reload the project, and you let the conflict resolution of the project sort it out. If I can do it inside the project easily, like just right-click on it, it might be in the digitizer virtual folder, and I'll just right-click and say rename. Comes up with a save as dialog. I don't actually change the name, but I change the location, and then it takes care of that for me. But that's not really a mass move thing. That's just a VI at a time thing. Q.
So another kind of trick or hack too is, I think it's fixed in LabVIEW 2020, but in earlier versions of LabVIEW, if you open like the properties dialog on a class, and it's really opening really slow because it's trying to find all of the inheritance or whatever. For whatever reason, if you do that same operation from the files and right click on your class and go to properties, that will open up 10 times faster. So just pro tip, I guess.
LabVIEW pro tip of the day. Okay, let's keep moving. Here's a controversial one. Use block diagram cleanup. Who uses block diagram cleanup? Yeah, and a third of the room, more than I thought. I actually like it, but I also appreciate undo. I'll see what it does, And it's like, yeah, I'm good with that. But sometimes it's like, nope, I liked what I had before, and so I'll just undo. I tend to find it's a good idea to save before and after. Save before you do block diagram cleanup. And then if you undo, then save right after that. Because I think something just typically the bulk changes of you just changed everything in this diagram and I've created a whole bunch of undo backup lists. And then I undo that. That's a time when LabVIEW has a tendency to crash. And so I've seen that. The other thing that, well, let me first say some of the reasons I like block diagram cleanup. One is, I've had customer VIs where, where there's hidden stuff. It's usually not an evil sub VI, but it might be, some unused code, for example, or like a constant that's a stray that's hidden under the boundary of the loop. Especially in older code before there was autogrow on structures. And also just to me, like if I have a string of VIs and I want to insert something, I'll just wire it up like this and then hit block diagram cleanup and let it resolve like this. I don't think that quick drop insert can handle 2 wires because I tried that. Okay, well, it must. I was looking it up and tried to do it, but it didn't. But if you remember the quick drop shortcut, that's another. Now, well, maybe. There's a lot of quick drop shortcuts to remember.
Brian?
But even not just inserting things, but there may be times when I just want to change up how things are wired. Like maybe I want to swap these two, and so I'll just remove the wires and wire them, and then do block diagram cleanup, and it'll swap them in the right spot. I don't think there's a quick drop thing for swapping the order of 2. See, that'll be in LabVIEW 2022. There's a comment back
Use the layout tools when you're building your block diagram. Hit all those sub VIs in the line top or something like that. It's very fast if you build a habit. And there's quick drop shortcuts for the same thing, and there's keyboard shortcuts for the alignment tool.
Yeah, the challenge there is that you have to select the right set of things to align. And so I can't just like draw a selection around all of this and do align top, because the wrong things will move to the wrong place. But I do use the alignment stuff a lot on both the panel and the block diagram. Okay, 11B. If you don't want to use block diagram cleanup, use the VI analyzer to find things like the hidden things that are under the edges of structures. There's or things miswired. That's another thing that block diagram cleanup can show you is like I think I'm wired to a particular terminal, but when I do my block diagram cleanup, I see that it's actually coming in from a different direction than it ought to be. So it indicates I've miswired something. And a VI analyzer can also help find some of that. Like I think it's like coming in from the right side for wires under objects. Yeah. Let's see. Number 12. Use the VI analyzer anyway. To me, it's just a good habit. Turn on all the tests, and then turn off the ones that you start to annoy you. That's kind of my typical approach. And some people, a lot of people use this as a way of enforcing their coding conventions, and so they'll come up with, their custom set of what are the settings and what are the tests that I want to enforce in all of my code, and make sure that passes. Make that part of your continuous integration, whatever, just to ensure code quality. So hopefully nobody objects to this idea. Here's a little controversial one. Take advantage of the unit label. Who has tried units and failed and never used them again? Okay, interesting. Who actually uses units from often? Yay, Stephen. We're on the same page. I wrote a blog post about this recently. You can go read it. It's a 2-parter, I think. But you have to know how it works. and don't fight it. And so those are the keys to being successful with the unit label. So I actually find there's a project I was working on that had some relatively complicated formulas using, in fact, the formula node. And also part of it was in an Excel spreadsheet with their own complicated formulas. But some of the values were inches, like it was a machine where the geometry was defined in inches, but in day-to-day operation, they always used centimeters. And it was also related to time. And so there were things that were in seconds and some things that were in hertz and some things that were in microseconds. And some values were represented as kilometers per second, which is also the same thing as millimeters per microsecond. And so, all of these different units floating around, and especially in these complicated formulas, it was real easy to, like divide where I meant to multiply. And the unit label prevents me from making those kind of mistakes. Because if, for example, if I have miles and hours and I divide them, I end up with velocity. Similarly, if I have like meters times hertz, I end up with velocity, right? So those things automatically take care of themselves when I use the unit label to make sure that I really end up with a compatible unit on the end of velocity and, distance divided by time. And especially when you have this relatively complicated algebraic formula that you're trying to sort out about, is that 10 hertz? Is that 10 centimeters? What is that 10? And you're trying to decipher that. And like, in order for the end result of, I know that velocity needs to come out at the end, this has to be hertz. I have to interpret what that 10 in this magic formula means. And I can then document my code as like, that is now hertz. I know that it hurts in order for the math to work out right. So I'd recommend giving it a try. Are you about to say something? Okay. Any other comments? Who wants to comment on the opposite side of this argument? The thing that it's important to understand is that internally LabVIEW stores the values in base SI units. So MI's miles. So 1 mile is the base SI unit for length is meters, right? And so internally, that is however many meters are in 1 mile. The base SI unit for time is seconds. The base SI unit for temperature is degrees Kelvin. So 0 degrees C is really, for some 173.15. And so then kind of understanding then that the unit label is really just for display. Part of the role of the unit label is for display. So internally, it's not storing 1, but for display, it's converting it to 1, right? Because I've got miles here. And then also, I can change this at runtime, since it's only a display thing. So if I'm running this VI, and I want to see, well, how much is that in meters? I can just change MI to M and see it. So that's also really useful, like for temperature. If I want to, like, what is this in degrees C? What's it in degrees Fahrenheit? What do you mean by decimal conversion? Decibels. No, it does not. It does not do nonlinear units. That's one of the requested features as nonlinear units. It also doesn't do custom units. Like how many cows do you have? Somewhere I have a feature specification internally in LabVIEW to do all those things, but it never got prioritized. Okay. We're out of time. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. Use create sub VI, do sub VIs, use sub VIs, change the icon. And then this sort of like this catch-all at the end of just like, or actually there's this one. Don't be clever. that's kind of a mantra of mine always. It's just like, don't write code that is clear about what it does, as clear as you can, as opposed to just being clever. I hate clever programmers that want to show off because it's a maintenance nightmare. All right. And then finally, my additional resources. Darren has this great presentation on brainless LabVIEW programming. There's at least one or two topics that I covered that he's covered better and more thoroughly. And a couple of blogs that I have with some of this information on it. So thank you very much. Out of time. Appreciate it.